Thank you very much, Ridwan. Thank you to MPAC. I'm going first, so I think I should be the most general. It might seem that I'm going first as the senior member of the panel, but actually when I started researching Islamist movements, I sat down with a young grad student at Georgetown, who's been doing it longer than I have, who actually gave me his whole Rolodex of contacts with me, and that's Shadi right here. So his hair is darker and fuller, but he's my senior. So I'll set him up, I guess, and then Peter can wrap up. So let me just talk about, if I'm going to be general, just what is the Muslim Brotherhood? And I'll say a little bit about the implications of designation in the process, but I'll leave most of that to others. So is there such an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood? And the answer is kind of yes. There is an organization. If you talk to people from the Muslim Brotherhood, one of the things that I noticed very strikingly is how many sentences begin with the word we. So there's a very, very strong sense of organization. And I think there's a sense of mission, that there's something that the Brotherhood is about, or they'll talk about the menhaj, the model, or essentially a project essentially of reform of society, making the person, making the individual, the family, and the entire society more moral on Islamic lines. So those things exist. But the one misleading word that I've just used is organization in the singular, because the Muslim Brotherhood is certain, there is such a thing as a Muslim Brotherhood, but it exists in many different forms in many different countries. Interestingly enough, if you look at Brotherhood history, I mean, the organization began in Egypt. But the question arose fairly early on, especially as members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood went to other countries and sometimes advised or even began organizations in those countries. Was membership portable? That is, if you were a member of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and you were active in Kuwait, were you a member of the Kuwaiti Muslim Brotherhood? And the answer fairly early on was no, that these were different national organizations, that they shared experiences, they shared the general model. They shared an awful lot of sort of curriculum documents and ideas and so on, but they were organizationally distinct. And that was wise because although the Brotherhood often prides itself on being very practical, the practical issues in each society were very, very different. So each society would know, each organization would know the appropriate way to behave. And this played itself out very obviously in ways in which various organizations behaved. At a time, for instance, when no member of the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood would have an official meeting with a member of the United States government, because the United States government was occupying Iraq. This was after the invasion of Iraq. The Iraqi Islamic Party, which was an organization that sort of developed partly out of the Iraqi Muslim Brotherhood, was actually cooperating with the American occupation. So, and if you'd ask Jordanian Muslim Brotherhoods about this, they would say, yeah, well, that's Iraq. This is Jordan. And so every country, every movement had to decide its own way. They were aware of each other. There is some kind of loose and formal linkage between the two. When I was at the Carnegie Endowment, working on this 15 years ago, we had a series of meetings with Brotherhood activists from various countries. And I remember asking them, so how often do you meet? And the answer was consistent. Whenever you call us together. So again, they were very, very aware of each other, but some of the introductions of leading members were ones that I personally made to each other. So it makes more sense to think of the Muslim Brotherhood as a set of organizations that watch each other, that follow the same kind of model, and so on. Now, but that are organizationally distinct. Is a Muslim Brotherhood involved in terrorism? Well, if you look at the sort of whole range of Muslim Brotherhood organizations and you look at standard definitions of terrorism, the answer would have to be some have been. That is to say, if you define most definitions of terrorism center around attempts to harm civilians for political purposes in order to intimidate or spread fear. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 1940s was engaged in some assassinations of civilian political leaders. So it certainly would qualify at that time. That was more than half a century ago. And more recently, I think you would have a much harder case. Hamas is obviously an organization that has engaged in terrorism as according to any kind of scholarly or legal definition. Hamas's relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood is complicated. In a sense, it was formed out of the Muslim Brotherhood, but partly in reaction against an older generation of Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood leaders whom they saw as insufficiently active. The movement's formal name, the Movement of Islamic Resistance, is essentially there to say, wait, we need an Islamic resistance movement. This was back in the 1980s to take to act alongside the non-Islamic movements, the nationalist movements, the Marxist movements, and so on. And the older generation of Muslim Brotherhood leaders are simply sitting around waiting for things to happen and trying to become better Muslims and leaving the resistance field. And so it was partly a reaction, as I say, against the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, but also drawing on, to some extent, the Muslim Brotherhood model. So it's a little bit distinctive, but I think in any definition, any, as I say, academic or legal definition, certainly you would qualify it that way. Most other Brotherhood organizations, no. The Jordanian one was legal entity until fairly recently. The legal situation in Jordan is enormously complex. In Kuwait, you've got an Islamic movement that has legally recognized faces that simply participate in charitable or other activities. So you really have to go almost case by case, and the answer for the vast majority of Brotherhood organizations is no. So let me say something about this designation process. So this is something that exists in American law, and it's actually been growing in American law over something like 3 decades at this point, centered around some version of the definition that I just gave, but setting up essentially a process, an administrative process, an interagency process by which to decide is the group to be designated. Now, when I look at the results of that process, I say it's certainly politically inflected. That is to say, who gets on the list and who gets dropped from the list and who's not even considered does to some extent reflect in a very general way American political priorities. But when I talk to anybody who's been involved in the process, they say this is really serious. It's tedious. It's gathering an awful lot of information. It's coordinating about different agencies and so on. And so the idea of doing it legislatively, that is making an end round around that entire process, is something that looks a little bit odd. It is clearly politically motivated rather than, as I say, kind of motivated by any process, any kind of legal process. It's essentially trying to amend the law to give the result that the advocates of designation want and cannot get through the existing legal process. So it's to tailor the law specifically to get the result that they want for an organization. And I will say that's odd. It has sometimes been done for Palestinian groups, but to do it for the Muslim Brotherhood, something that isn't even clearly, as I say, a single organization, is particularly problematic, especially, and I should leave more of this to the other speakers, but especially when you read the text of the proposed legislation, it is one that is potentially extremely far-reaching because it essentially presumes, you would almost think that who's ever writing this has kind of the organization model of organized crime, something that exists below ground, but has all kinds of above ground legal entities that appear in kind of different ways, shapes, or form. And so the effect would be essentially to take this group of organizations that exist in many different countries in many different forms, sometimes legally recognized, sometimes in political systems that aren't going to allow legal recognition for an organization like this, kind of tying them all together, and anything that looks vaguely associated with them is potentially implicated by the legislation. So it's essentially taking an idea of what the Brotherhood is that is not reflected in its history or actual organization, and putting it in the and writing that into law in a way that I think could have, I was going to say unanticipated consequences. I'm not sure they're all unanticipated, but they could have far-reaching implications for Brotherhood movements internationally and for Muslim institutions and Muslim organizations domestically that might somehow be tied into this. But again, I'll leave more details on that to the other speakers. Thank you.